words of the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. It's God's word to us this morning. So, have you ever heard the phrase, I owe you one? You ever heard this phrase before? Usually we say this phrase in a very positive sense, right? So somebody does you a favor, somebody gives you their cloak, somebody goes with you the extra mile, somebody does you some sort of favor, and you will look at them and you'll say to them, man, thanks, I'm so grateful, I'm so thankful that you have been so kind to me, I owe you one. You ever said this to anybody? Yes. Hopefully you said what you meant and meant what you said, right? Going back to last week, yes? Okay. Let me push it slightly. Have you ever thought to yourself, I owe you one? This is a little bit more sinister than saying to somebody, hey, thanks, man, I owe you one. This comes along with a, and a dark look, and maybe you just think, I owe you one. In other words, just you wait until I get you back. It's the kind of thing that we used to say, think when I was at boarding school. People used to play practical jokes all the time when I was at boarding school. They would apple pie your bed. Have you ever heard of this? Basically what they did, they fold the sheet inside back so that when you climb into bed, you can't get your legs into bed, which isn't really a problem and a big deal, but the sheets were so threadbare that you'd put your foot through the sheet, and then you'd have to go to the matron with a damaged sheet and explain why, right? And when people did this, you'd look at them and you'd be like, I owe you one. You wouldn't say it, you just think it. Or maybe they'd give you a fright, as you come into the dormitory and you'd think, I owe you one. I once got into bed when I was in boarding school and somebody had put a toad in my bed. The poor thing had messed itself. It was awful. And I remember getting out of bed covered with toad and taking the toad out and coming back into the dormitory and, you guys are so funny, I owe you one. It's just this kind of, I'm going to get you, right? Just you wait until the opportunity comes. I'm going to get you. And maybe similar to this phrase is a phrase that you might have counseled somebody with before. Hey, listen, don't get mad. Just get even, right? Don't get mad with the people that have hurt you. Don't get mad with the people that have upset you. Don't get mad with the people that have offended you. Just get even. It seems to me that this is where the rabbis and the teachers of the law were leaning with their understanding of eye for eye and tooth for tooth. They'd kind of taken the law of God and they'd kind of watered it down and reapplied it and that sort of thing and said, hey, it's an excuse for, we don't need to get mad, but we are allowed to get even. And their taking of that law was a far cry from what it was intended to do in the very first place. When you read through the Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, where this phrase turns up again and again, when you read through there, you realize that the law, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, was part of the civil law of Israel. So it was Israel's way of governing themselves, a kind of what to do when X, Y, and Z happens to your property or to your person. So what must we do if I dig a pit and David's donkey comes along and falls into my pit and damages itself? What must now be done so that David can get recompense for the loss that he's experienced? Does it make sense? What happens if my bull, which is wild and badly behaved, runs out of its pen and goes and gores the person next door and they're seriously injured? What must be done? What must be done if two men are fighting and somehow a pregnant woman is injured in the midst of the fighting that is taking place and there is serious injury? What must be done? Well, what must be done is eye for eye, tooth for tooth, bruise for bruise, hand for hand, foot for foot, life for life, wound for wound. You need to get even, in a sense. Right? You need to receive recompense. The same phrase appears again in the book of Leviticus, and here it is. So what happens if my neighbor, if I injure my neighbor, or if I do some harm to my neighbor or something like that. Now, what needs to be done in this instance if my neighbor is hurt? And Leviticus says, well, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, wound for wound, bruise for bruise, hand for hand, and so on. Fast forward to Deuteronomy, and the phrase turns up again. The only difference in that occasion is when it's when a false witness is coming and bearing false witness against somebody else. So let's just say somebody takes me to court and is making all sorts of accusations against me, all right? And so there's going to be a penalty that's going to be incurred. But in the process of the court proceedings, they discover that the person is being a false witness, and they're just telling lies, all right? They're trying to throw the book at me. Guess what I get to do? Throw the book at them, right? Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And when you look at it in that particular sense, you get to appreciate what the law was intended to do. It was intended to do three things, all right? Number one, it was intended to define what compensation is mine by right. If David's donkey has kind of damaged itself falling into my pit, now what compensation is David's by right? It also shows where these laws belong. And the answer to that question is they belonged in the law courts. All these different things in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, they describe the laws of retribution, and they belong in the law courts, not in everyday normal relationships that people have. And it also shows how far you can go. The whole purpose of these laws was to provide control, to provide restraint. So let's just say Nico and I get into an argument. Nico blinds me with a left hook that knocks out my front tooth. I can't go to him and say, listen, I'm going to take your eye now, right? It doesn't go tooth for eye. It's tooth for tooth. Yeah, okay, eye for eye, and so on. But the real spirit of the law would have been, if let's just say that Nico does punch me with a left hook, right, that catches me unawares, and my front two teeth are knocked out. The real spirit of the law would be, I would turn around to Nico and say, hey, let's just be friends. Right? I'm not going to demand retribution. Although I can take you to court, although I can get what is mine by right, I'm not going to go for it. And actually, do you know what? I'm just going to let this slide, because what matters more to me is not that I get what is due to me, but what matters more to me is the fact that we have a relationship, that we have a friendship. Does it make sense? But the problem is the teachers of the law and the rabbis and so on had taken this law and they'd brought it into the realms of, out of the law courts, into the realms of everyday, normal relationships. They were saying, hey, eye for eye and tooth for tooth anytime I want. If you do anything to me, if you do anything to harm my property, to harm my person, to offend me in the slightest way, then here's the law that applies in our relationship. I'm going to stand up my legal rights, and I'm going to ensure that I get eye for eye and I get tooth for tooth. I'm going to demand retribution. I'm going to demand compensation. Instead of relating to one another out of love and affection, the people of God had started to relate to one another based on their rights. And how many of you know if we relate to one another out of what is mine by right, and this whole business of I owe you one and you owe me one, and that, relationships are going to be a mess, right? They're going to be they're just going to be fraught with all sorts of mess. In the West, I remember years ago, there was this real culture of if anybody did anything, well, that's fine, just sue them. Right? And don't sue them for a little bit. Make sure that phrase, take them to the cleaners. Have you heard that phrase? Yeah? In other words, take them for everything that they are worth. Right? Don't get mad. Just get even. And Jesus steps into all of this and speaking to his followers and as we've seen over the past few weeks, so much of what he's saying and so much of what he's correcting about the teaching of the day focuses on relationships. Anger wrecks relationships. Lust, adultery wrecks relationships. And Jesus is trying to correct all of these things. And so again, he hits the refresh button and he says to them, listen, but I say to you. And here's where you need to take a deep breath. Because at this point here, we are now hitting the very high watermark moment of the Sermon on the Mount. This is the point where we're going to stand on the mountaintop. if you have thought over the last few weeks, hey, this Sermon on the Mount business and living in the kingdom business, this is really challenging, okay? Nothing in comparison to what we are touching on over the next 2 weeks. This is the point where I think the Sermon on the Mount really calls the followers of Jesus to dig right down deep into the deepest part of us. Because what Jesus calls us to here is a extravagant, outrageous, doesn't make sense kind of love that we're supposed to show towards other people. And what we would love to do, well, maybe I'm just speaking for myself here, what we would love to do is dodge this passage, right? Water it down a little bit. Perhaps ignore it a little bit. Make it more palatable, make it more comfortable, put it in a little box by Jesus didn't really mean what he was saying, but the thing is we don't get to do that. If you're a follower of Jesus, this verse calls us to something pretty costly. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. What Jesus is in essence saying to his followers is, leave the law in the law courts. Right? Get rid of any kind of idea of I owe you one in a sinister sense. Get rid of any idea that don't get mad, get even. Leave the law in the law courts. It doesn't belong in your personal relationships, which are intended to be governed not by legal rights and such like, but to be governed by love. Where you love other people the same way that you would have them love you. Jesus is saying to his followers, in the context of your personal relationship, here's what love requires of you. If somebody hurts you, if somebody upsets you, if somebody offends you, don't literally take the law into your own hands and insist on getting your rights, but rather love them back. Who knows, maybe you will win that brother or sister over who has done this. The women and men of God are intended to be people of love, selfless people who, although hurt and offended by others and an evil person and that sort of thing, don't stand on our rights, but rather choose not to exact revenge, not to exact retribution, and to rather repay evil with good. Now, let me just unpack this a little bit, okay? Because I know that a verse like this could be open to misrepresentation and misunderstanding, and all sorts of questions might come into our minds. So let me just point out 3 things that I believe Jesus is not saying, okay? 3 things that Jesus is not saying. I do not believe that Jesus is saying to people who might be the victims of abuse, whether it is physical, emotional, sexual, or mental abuse, I do not believe that he is saying to them, hey, make sure you don't resist the evil person that is doing these things to you. To think something like that would be utterly grotesque. To think that Jesus would even mean that is just so far from what he has in mind here. And I think Jesus' advice to somebody who may find themselves in that particular position would be to say to them, listen, get help urgently. Don't leave things in the dark, but make sure that you get help urgently and get out. Get out of that abusive relationship. So Jesus is not talking to victims and saying, hey, listen, you've just got to put up with it, right? The second thing that Jesus is not saying, he's not saying that we can't defend ourselves. Right? He's not saying that somebody, if somebody comes against me, is going for Adele and that sort of thing, I'm not going to step back and I'm going to say, listen, just carry on, No, in that moment, I'm going to stand in front, right? And I'm going to defend Adele and my 2 sons with everything that is within me. All right? So Jesus is not saying that we can't defend ourselves. He's also not saying that we must be weaklings. He's also not saying that we need to be doormats that other people in this world will just kind of walk over in every opportunity. But he is calling us to a lifestyle where we don't respond with revenge and we don't try exact retribution from others. I like what one author said when he talks about the kind of people that these verses depict. It depicts the strong man whose control of himself and love for others is so powerful that he rejects absolutely every form of retaliation. I'll read that again for you. These verses depict the strong man whose control of himself and love for others are so powerful that he rejects absolutely every conceivable form of retaliation. And you can imagine Jesus' followers as they hear him say this, but I say to you, do not resist an evil person. You can imagine them sitting there looking at Jesus thinking, what does that mean? What does that look like on Monday or Wednesday or in a month's time or in 3 months' time? How are we supposed to live that out? And so Jesus says, I tell you, don't resist an evil person. And then he gives 4 little pictures, 4 little illustrations for which the Sermon on the Mount is so famously known for. 4 illustrations that unpack this. 4 illustrations that answer the question, what is it that love requires of us? Because remember, we've got a new heart. If you're a follower of Jesus, you've got a new heart, right? It's been implanted and engraved and imputed with righteousness. Has the law of Christ written on it, which is to love God and love people. It constantly prods you with the question, what does love require of us? And Jesus is answering this question. What does love require of us when we're faced with an evil person? And he gives 4 little pictures. 4 pictures that you're probably familiar with, 4 pictures that you've heard spoken about and that sort of thing. But let me just unpack them briefly for you so that you understand the context that they were written in. Number 1, turn the other cheek. When Jesus says to his disciples, if somebody strikes you on the right cheek, you need to turn to them the left cheek as well. What he has in mind is somebody standing in front of somebody else and taking their hand like this and backhanding them across the side of the face. It's violent. It's not very nice. But the point is not the physical violence. The point is the insult. In ancient Near Eastern customs, and still in some parts of the world today, if you strike somebody across the face with the back of your hand, it is a massive insult to that person. In Jesus' time, if somebody hit you in this way, you would be able to take them to court. That's how serious it was. That's how insulting it was. So Jesus here, he's not talking about physical violence done from one person to the next. At the heart of what he's saying is, when people insult you, when people falsely accuse you, when people say all sorts of nasty things about you, turn the other cheek. Let the insults come. You don't need to defend yourself in this moment. Just let it roll on. Easy, right? Not so, I think. I remember when I was in standard 6 at school, it's the equivalent of year 7, so I probably would have been about 11, 12 years old. I remember at school, at the end of one day, I was standing in the classroom, and the teacher that was teaching us, he said to pack up your bags. I remember hearing him say, pack up your bags. The next thing I remember was him standing right in front of me, and he went like that, and he smashed me across the side of the face with the back of his hand so that I fell into the desk where I was sitting. I also remember in my years as a serving church and being a pastor, some of the insults, some of the false things that have been said about me, some of the accusations that have been leveled in my direction. And guess what? These were by brothers in Christ. Guess which one hurts the most? Guess which one leaves the deepest scar? Guess which one takes the most time to work through and to work out of your system? What Jesus calls us here to is very high kind of love, a very costly kind of love. Turn the other cheek. If somebody sues you for your tunic, well, give them your coat as well. And again here, it's the context that we need to kind of understand what Jesus is saying. Somebody could sue you for your tunic, right? They could sue you for your shirt. Right? They could take you to court and literally take the shirt from your back. But they weren't allowed to sue you in Jewish custom for your cloak. Right? For the Jewish person, the cloak was sacred. It was sacrosanct. It was actually protected by law. Right? So let's just say I go and I borrow a spade from Linda, right? She's my next door neighbor. I go borrow a spade from Linda and that sort of thing. I promise I'll give you the spade back by nightfall, and here's my cloak as a pledge to make sure that I will give it back to you. Even if I didn't give the spade back by the end of the night, Linda was compelled by law, under law, to make sure she gives the cloak back. You couldn't sue somebody for their cloak. You couldn't take it from them in this way. It was the thing that covered them during the day and the thing that would keep them warm at night. And so the Mosaic law protected people in this in this way. And so what Jesus is saying here, he's not talking about clothes and that sort of thing. Hopefully you know this, right? He's talking about, listen, don't stand on your rights. Don't demand your rights in your relationships with other people. Right? You don't need to do that. Lean into being gracious. Lean into being kind towards other people. Lean into the generosity that we see reflected in the Father's heart. But again, it's not easy to do, is it? Because we want what is ours by right. And we want to make sure that things are evened out at the end of the day. And Jesus is not done. He moves on to the next one. He says, go the extra mile. All right, and we're familiar with this phrase, but again, the kind of context, just to fill it out for us, is in at the time when Jesus speaks these words, the Jewish people are being occupied by Rome. And something a Roman soldier was legally allowed to do was he could take a Jewish person, regardless of what they may have been busy with, he could grab them and say to them, listen, I want you to go 1,000 miles for me, 1,000 paces for me, roughly the equivalent of 1 mile. He couldn't make him go any further, but he could say to him, listen, I've got to move these bricks from here to over there. Can you pick them up and move them? It didn't matter if I'm a Jewish man, I'm on my way to work, the Roman soldier sees me, he says, pick up the bricks, move them from here to there. And I couldn't say, no, I'm not doing it. I had to. I was compelled. I had to go and to do this. Can you imagine how demeaning this would be? Because every time a Roman soldier did this to a Jewish person, they were effectively saying to the Jewish person, don't forget, I own you. You belong to us. Every time a Roman soldier said to a Jewish man, listen, move this from here to there, it was saying, listen, just remember whose boot it is that is on your neck in this relationship. And Jesus says, well, when he makes you go 1,000 paces, go another 1,000. And there's a I don't know if it's an irony, but there's something interesting that's happening here, because Jesus is saying, if a Roman soldier tells you to go 1,000 paces, in a sense, he owes you a mile, right? And Jesus is saying, hey, pay his debt for him by going another 1,000 paces. Not easy to do, is it? When people break in and interrupt our lives in this way and demand things from us, demand our time, demand our resources, demand our wisdom. And Jesus is saying, don't ghost them, don't blank them, right? Go the extra yardage with them. Give them time and more so. If anybody asks anything from you, don't withhold it from them. If anybody wants to borrow something from you, don't withhold it from them. And here in Jewish law, I don't think there's anything that actually people were under law to do these things. But Jesus is saying, listen, do it anyway. Our temptation and our desire is we like to lean into Proverbs 3:27, which says along these words. I'll find it for a second. We lean into Proverbs 3:27, which talks about not withholding a gift from somebody who is righteous or somebody who deserves it and that sort of thing. We're really good at that, aren't we? And we won't withhold stuff from people who bless us and who are kind to us, or we won't withhold things from people that we want to be our friends. And Jesus is saying, do all of that, absolutely. But also do it for your enemy. Also do it for the evil person. Also do it for the person who has offended you, who has hurt you, who is falsely accused of different things, who in their relationship, they stand on their rights when they relate to you. They're constantly asking you to go the extra mile. Give to them. And all of these, obviously, all of these different examples that Jesus gives, they require great wisdom and discernment. And perhaps this one is the one that requires the most discernment and the most wisdom. Because remember, we're answering the question, what does love require of me? And sometimes the most loving thing to do when people ask you for stuff, sometimes the most loving thing to do is to say no. If somebody is coercing you or manipulating you, it's not loving to give in to that. If you know that by giving, you might actually be feeding somebody else's habit or a dependency It might not be the most loving thing to do. Here we're called to listen to God and to seek His wisdom and to seek discernment from Him and to be creative in the ways that we might give to people. It might not be the wisest thing to give somebody a $5, but you could buy them a sandwich or a bus ticket or a train ticket or demonstrate generosity of spirit in that way. Jesus says, but I say to you, this is what love requires of you. Don't resist an evil person. Turn the other cheek. Give your coat as well. Go the extra mile. Give to those who are asking you. And if you look closely at these 4 things, you'll notice that in each of these illustrations, you have an evil person doing something to us. And Jesus says our response is not to be retaliation and seeking revenge, but actually paying double what is asked of us in the first place. Jesus is saying in these moments, we need to lean into grace and seek that our responses will always be gracious. Jesus is calling us to be what C.H. Spurgeon described as we're to be the anvil where bad men are the hammer. But it's not easy, is it? To live in this way and to kind of default in this way in our relationships with other people, it's not easy. I look at these verses and I think to myself, how far short I fall of what God's standard is. How desperately I need His grace to help me. How much I need to pray, Father, have mercy on me. How much I need to say, God, I need your Spirit to help me. You've heard me say it here many, many times, hopefully by now. It is impossible to live the Christian life as God intended us to live it without the fullness of the Spirit. Because this stuff does not come naturally to us. It doesn't come naturally to me. And I need the Spirit's help to move me in the right direction. I need to pray, come Holy Spirit and fill me and help me to follow Jesus' example, because that's what we're called to as disciples of Jesus Christ. We're called to follow, to walk so closely with Jesus that our lives end up mirroring His life. And these words that He speaks, they weren't just fanciful ideas that He didn't expect His followers to obey. No, He spoke them expecting that we would obey. And He left us the example to follow. Turn to the end of the book of Mark and you read about Jesus, who turns the other cheek in front of the chief priest and so on. He's spat on, he's falsely accused, he's knocked down. Mark's gospel stands out to me because he uses this phrase, they beat him again and again. Again and again, not just once, again and again. And then taken from the Sanhedrin, he's goes to Pilate, and Pilate sends him to the Roman soldiers. And what do? They put a crown of thorns in his head. They put a purple robe around him, and they spit on him some more. And then they take a staff, the butt end of a staff. We're talking about a stick, a really heavy, hard stick, and they strike him on the head again and again. And not a single word is spoken in retaliation. And Jesus, although He could call a whole legion of angels to come to His defense, He doesn't. And so Peter, looking at that, he kind of concludes for us. He says, to this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in His steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in His mouth. When they hurled their insults at Him, He didn't retaliate. And when He suffered, He made no threats. Instead, He entrusted Himself to Him who judges justly. The example that Jesus leaves for us is the one that He calls us to follow. In these moments when we're faced with evil people, and you will be faced with them. How we need the Spirit to help us to follow Christ's example. How we need the Spirit to help us to pass the test. Because make no mistake, when you're faced with an evil person, you will be tested. In actual fact, you might not know what testing is like until such time as you're faced with an evil person. You will not know how deeply ingrained the Beatitudes are in your life, how poor in spirit you really are, how much of a peacemaker you are, how pure in heart you are, how much you hunger and thirst for righteousness. You won't know how loving you are, gentle, patient, kind, good, self-controlled you are until such time as you are faced with an evil person. And in that moment, that stuff that is the deepest part of your heart will come to the surface. There is nothing like evil people who oppose us and insult us and treat us poorly to really bring to the fore what is rooted very deeply in our hearts. Jesus says in Mark's gospel, everyone will be salted with fire. There is nothing like the fiery trial of being faced with evil people and responding the way that Jesus does. But in this moment, this is where we need the Spirit's help. In this moment, if we can forego getting revenge and getting retribution, do you know what will happen? The Father will come with his divine secateurs, and he will prune out of you your ego, and he will prune out of you your self-entitlement, and he will prune out of you pride, so that you can be more poor in spirit, so that you can be more pure in heart, so that you can be more of a peacemaker, so that you will hunger and thirst for righteousness, so that you will be loving, joyful, peace, patience, kind, goodness, gentle, and self-control. These things, you cannot learn this anywhere else other than in the school of pain and the school of suffering. But our natural inclination is to do what? Run for the hills. Any sign of suffering, let's just run for the hills. Let's just do it the world's way. God, don't get me through this. Our prayer usually is, God, get me out of this. Get me under this trial or around this trial or over this trial. Don't take me through this trial. And God says, no, we're going through it. Because as I go through it with you, you will be shaped. How we need the Spirit to follow Jesus' example, how we need the Spirit to help us pass the test, and how we need the Spirit to help us to trust God. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it's that it comes down to. Have you ever wondered to yourself, why is it that I want to get back at somebody so badly? Why is it that I want revenge? Why is it that I'm not going to get mad, I'm going to get even? Right? Why is it that I want to say to people, I owe you one, right? And the day is going to come, right? Why is it that we want to do that? There may be lots of reasons. But could one of the reasons be because we don't want them to get away with it? And we don't trust that God would hold them to account. And so therefore, we're going to take matters into our own hands and make sure that justice is done. Think back to the last time that you demanded compensation, retribution. What was the root reason for that? Was it not because you wanted to make sure that they didn't get away with it? And the only remedy for this is to come to the cross. Because it's as we come to the cross that we realize afresh that nobody gets away with it. When somebody has offended you, when somebody has hurt you, when somebody has sinned against you, they will not get away with it. Every single person is going to have to stand before the judgment seat of the righteous God of glory. Everybody. You, me, everyone. And in that moment, this is where the theology of the cross, we really need to drill down on the theology of the cross and allow it to transform our lives. When that moment comes, when the person stands before God, one of two things will happen. Either they would have put their trust in Jesus Christ, and all the sin that they have ever committed will be laid upon the Son of God who died for them. And they will come and stand before the Father, and the Father will say, well done, good and faithful servant, come and enter into your master's, your Father's happiness. That's the one thing that could possibly happen. If that doesn't happen, they will stand before the righteous judge, and he will say, get away, I never knew you. And they'll be shut out of the presence of the Almighty God to eternal damnation forever. But the point is, nothing gets swept under the carpet. Nothing gets swept under the carpet. There's not a single thing that God, where you've turned your cheek and you've said, God, I'm going to hold on to your work. There's not a single thing that God says, oh, we're just going to forget about that one. Everything will be called to account. And either Jesus would have made atonement for the sin, or a person will have to pay the penalty for their sin. But the whole point is here, you can entrust yourself to God. You don't need to take matters into your own hands. You don't need to exact revenge. You don't need to demand compensation, because we're moving to a day when Jesus will do that for you. And I think that his judgments will be much better than yours and mine, don't you think? And so as Felicia and the team come up and we prepare our hearts for the communion table to take the bread and wine, I'd just fix your eyes in this moment as we sing together and we prepare our hearts for this. Just fix your eyes on this, that Jesus turned the other cheek for you. He did this for you. Didn't stand on his rights and ceremony or anything like that in the moment when he was accused, but instead, with your name and your face in mind, he turned the other cheek. Jesus gave his coat, perhaps not literally his cloak, but according to Philippians chapter 2, he didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped. But he humbled himself and he became like you and he became like me and he became obedient to death on the cross. For what purpose? To bring you to God. And Jesus has gone the extra mile for you. How many times has Jesus gone the extra mile for you? How many times have you come before this table and you're confessing stuff that you confessed last month, but you just keep stumbling here, right? And Jesus is like, I'm not going to turn you away. I'm going to go the extra mile for you. I'm going to bear your burden for you. And giving to us. And Paul says it so beautifully in 2 Corinthians 8, 9, thereabouts. He says that Jesus, although he was rich in every way, for your sake, for my sake, he became poor, so that through his poverty we might become rich and the righteousness of God. Fix these things in your mind as we come to this table and as we sing about amazing grace and as we sing about chains falling off. Fix your mind in this place, and then we'll break the bread and share the wine together.